Today we're going to begin the Cold War. The Cold War is a pretty long time period, 1945 to 1991, and it encompasses quite a few conflicts, confrontations with primarily the Soviet Union, although there are others. And so there's a lot to keep straight here. So go as you listen to the lecture, go through in your notes to make sure that you have all of the pertinent information down, because some of you weren't writing down everything, and you really need to know a good bit of this. So as you look at this, you notice we only have two sections. So we'll be doing the Cold War today, and we'll look at post-war America tomorrow, okay? The beginnings of the Cold War have really World War II to blame, and part of that is the question comes down to how do we govern, how do we control the conquered territories in Europe. Britain and the United States say, and this is them right here, Britain and the United States say they should not be occupied, that they should be allowed and able to have free and fair elections. Britain and the United States want to create democracies in these areas. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, doesn't see it that way. And if you'll look at them again, you can see here's Germany. And understand that for two wars, both World War I and World War II, Germany has swept its way into Russia/Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is concerned at this point, and they decide that they want this area to be a buffer zone. Now, a buffer is an edge of protection, let's call it that. And so if Germany starts to move again, if they become strong and begin to move again, they're going to have to go through Poland first. They're going to have to go, through this area, and they're going to have a lot of say in this area. They're actually going to set up, let's just call them puppet governments here, but they want this as a way to protect them against a future strong Germany. And in some ways it makes sense, that fear. We could see the same idea with France after World War I with the Rhineland and things like that. So it totally makes sense. And you consider how many lives they had lost and how much property was damaged and destroyed. That's their reasoning. And the United States and Britain weren't really on board with that. And consider too that at the Yalta Conference where this was decided, that they mentioned wanting, to occupy this briefly, and Britain and the United States, I guess, allowed themselves to believe that it was meant to be a temporary measure. Stalin never had any intention of it being temporary. So there were some misunderstandings at Yalta, which kind of set this up. Okay, so after World War II, Stalin is going to control East Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. And I've got Yugoslavia in parentheses here. Part of this is because even though Yugoslavia is communist, they're not aligned with the Soviet Union. And Albania was aligned with the Soviet Union until 1960. So I have those two kind of set off to the side, because again, if we look at the map, you can see that they all fall within this area, and Yugoslavia and Albania are right here, okay? And what Stalin's going to do is in these areas, he is going to set up communist governments, okay? Communist regimes that are answerable to him, and that's why I said that he set up puppet governments in these areas, okay? So what we have to deal with in the United States, or what we have to ask ourselves, is how are we going to deal with this? Communism is an enemy. Communism is not, it's more than what we feared after World War I, and we're going to talk about the post-World War II Red Scare in it tomorrow. But how's our government going to deal with the real threat of worldwide communism? And so the president at the time was Harry S. Truman, and in 1946 he is going to give us the Truman Doctrine. And it states that we would not hesitate to intervene and aid nations overseas to resist communism. Now, what you need to know here is, yes, the Truman Doctrine, but if we had to put this in one word, it would be containment. Okay, you do need to know what containment is, and think of a container. You put a lid on a bowl and you turn it upside down, and hopefully the liquid you have in it or the food you have in it or whatever it is stays in place, and that's the whole point of containment. One thing containment is not, it is not getting rid of. You'll notice that is not our purpose here. Our purpose is not to get rid of communism, it is to contain it, stop the spread. Okay, and that's an important thing to remember here, okay? And we're going to apply this to Europe. And specifically, we're going to use it, and it's applying to all of Europe, but where do we specifically use it is Greece and Turkey. After the war, times were hard, and the communists are going to come in there, and you've got the workers' movements, the workers' unions, strikes, you've got and they are agitating the people. And on paper, communism looks good, especially if you don't have anything. And the United States is concerned enough to get involved, okay? And you can see here the communist buzzard is bringing in chaos. You'll notice he's holding a wrench. Workers Party, and we, our Congress, is rushing to save Western Europe, because that's where they're taking it to, is Western Europe, okay? How are we going to do it? How are we going to intervene? It's not always sending in an army. And in this case, is the Marshall Plan. And we do fear that the people in Europe, particularly those war-torn areas, would elect communist and socialist governments. Again, it looks good on paper. And so how can we prevent them from electing socialists and communists? Well, we can do that by giving money away, and we're good at that. We're good at providing money. We're good at providing funds. We're good at giving people money so they can rebuild. And if we can promote rebuilding, that will provide jobs. Jobs mean money. And so it would kind of rebuild their economy. Now, this applies to Europe, okay? And it is going to spark economic revival and prosperity in those countries, okay? It is going to help the suffering of a lot of people in these areas. And it is going to go a long way towards stopping communism from advancing in Western Europe, okay? And again, remember, a lot of them start because of economic hardships, okay? And so this helps make it a successful policy. One of the things, and I love this cartoon with Stalin as a basketball player, and he's trying to stop, the basket would be European recovery, but he's got to stop the ball. Stalin was upset at the Marshall Plan because he felt like that the Soviet Union should be able to use some of those funds too, because they were devastated also. And I think he was being purposefully ignorant of the fact that the point was to stop communism, okay? Here you have Europe, and don't they make him look bright, on a bicycle, and having a hard time staying up. And so the American taxpayer, which is funding the bicycle, that's their economy, is going to keep it up with the money, okay? So we're going to keep pumping, and we're going to ride our way into self-support. So a few things to keep in mind. Few things to keep in mind here, okay? Containment, the Truman Doctrine, and like I said, Greece and Turkey are those the first countries given aid. It is not the only place it was applied. Those were just the first who benefited from it. And then finally, the Marshall Plan. Now it says offered to all nations but the Soviet Union, because again, the purpose is to keep the communists from gaining power. All right, so after the war, what happens to Germany? Oh, went too far. we're going to divide them. We have three main countries, part of the alliance, and I say three main countries because really France kind of wasn't really involved in the war that much because they pulled out. And so what we're going to do is it's going to be divided three ways. And Britain and the United States want to include a third area for France, and the Soviet Union is not really on board with that. And so what they tell them is fine, but it has to come out of your third. So they're going to carve out an area for France. But here you have the British, the American, and the French zones over here. You'll notice they're in blue. And then you have the Soviet zone in red. Okay, and then you have this little area in yellow in the middle of East Germany. Now this is Berlin. This is the capital city. And what do you do with Berlin? Well, you're going to end up, let me go back, I went the wrong way, I think. You're going to end up splitting Berlin also. Now this is in the midst of the Soviet, because this is going to become important in a minute when we talk about the blockade. But you'll notice that all around here is East German territory, and that's Soviet territory. And so we're going to split Berlin the same way we split Germany. You're going to have a French, a British, and a U.S. sector, okay? And you'll notice how the French sector is the smallest, kind of the same thing applied there. And this city is essentially two different halves, just two halves, okay? All right, you can kind of see it again. And this is how you get out. Here you have railways and you have autobahns. You can see here these are control points, but you have ways to get out and to get over, okay? But you have subways and you have those roads and railways and things like that. So there's ways to get out, at least initially, okay? But we're gonna separate it into West Germany, which is technically the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, which is the German Democratic Republic. I always love how the Soviets, who do not believe in democracy or really republicanism, communists always seem to put democratic or republic in it somewhere or another. Okay, now I just mentioned how we can get out if you live in West Berlin, which is controlled by Britain, France, and the United States, how you can get over to the western part of Germany. Well, that's good until 1948, and the Soviet Union is going to blockade it. They're not going to let anybody in or out. And here you have a great cartoon. This is the Russian bear surrounding it, and he's going to control who gets in and out. And you have so many people in East Berlin who are trying to escape. Communism versus democracy. A state-controlled economy versus a free economy, a capitalist economy. And there's so much more opportunity in the West and the East. So you have thousands and thousands of people flee to West Berlin from the eastern side. They just go over here, and then from here they can go over to West Germany, okay? So how do we stop that? Well, we're going to blockade Berlin. Now, the United States, Britain, and France are not happy with it. France doesn't really have much going on right now, but what Britain and the United States is going to do is they are going to begin the Berlin airlift, and this is going to last for about 15 months. We do not go to war. We do not bomb them. We do not initiate fighting. So keep that in mind. That's one of the reasons why this is called a Cold War. We kind of go right up to the brink and don't go far enough to actually declare war. We fight a lot of proxy wars, but just keep that in mind. How do we always deal with them? Well, it's not always with bloodshed. It's not always with war. But we're going to have the Berlin airlift, and we're just going to use these planes, and they flew 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Britain would fly during the day, and the United States at night, and we just dropped needed supplies into West Berlin until the Soviets were forced to give up in May of 1949. Okay, so this is considered a win for the United States. So the first confrontation is a win for us. And you can just see some of the pictures. I'm not really going to enlarge these. I'm going to enlarge some of the next ones, though, okay? Around the same time that we're ending that is a huge shock for the United States with the fall of China to communism. There had been a communist revolution going on in China following World War II. So from 1945 to 1949, there is a civil war going on in China. And we back the nationalists, and the nationalists are led by Chiang Kai-shek. And they're not strong enough, really, to stand against the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. The United States, remember the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine applies to Europe, but you still have this idea about not wanting to spread communism. But at the same time, do we really want to get involved in another war? And, you know, 1945, we just stopped a war. Do we want to get involved in another one? What do we do? How do we fight this? And so the answer is simple. We don't. We're going to throw some money at it. And really, that's what we do with a lot of things. We're just going to throw some money at it, and we're gonna try to send them some arms, and we're going to try to send them a little bit of aid. But really, it's not enough. There's just no way for us to help them enough, and we don't really want to get involved. And that's the huge thing there. And why do we care? Why do we care? Because here's the thing, and this is going to relate to what we'll talk about later with the domino theory. But you'll notice communist China is, again, this octopus. Octopus always evil, okay? Tentacles reaching. But look, if China becomes communist, they can stretch their tentacles to Tibet, Malay, Indochina, down here to Korea. So it's dangerous, okay? And here you've got nationalism, and got the communists, and the split here between the nationalists, and that's Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, which is Mao Zedong. And then I'll talk about Taiwan in a second. Okay. What happens is the communists are going to back the nationalists up to, really, to the coast. They're going to be forced to retreat to the edge of China, and they don't really have much option except to either surrender or find somewhere else to go. And so there's a little island off the Chinese coast called Formosa. Okay, it is called Formosa, and you'll notice here it says Taiwan, and that is what Formosa became known as, is Taiwan. And the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek are actually going to relocate to Taiwan, and where you're going to have a Chinese government in Taiwan, and then you're going to have a communist government in mainland China. Now, the United States refused to acknowledge the existence of communist China. The big China, we're going to act like does not exist. It isn't there. And then this little bitty, itty bitty island is the China that we're going to deal with up until Richard Nixon. Okay, so I mean, it's a big deal. But now I am going to say this: when China fell, when the nationalists fell to communism and China becomes communist, the United States is shocked. And at that point, we have to decide, what are we going to do? We can't let this happen again, because look, containment failed here, and we didn't do what we should. And so the next time, and it's really the next year, you'll notice that tentacle is reaching to Korea. The next year, what's going to happen is we're going to end up at war in Korea because of the spread of communism. Okay, and it's kind of hard to see this, but here's what happens. You see the Soviet Union is here. You see Japan is there. I say this for a reason. Remember, after the Germans surrendered in 1945, in May of 1945, and the Soviets agreed to help us defeat the Japanese after that. And so what the Soviets are going to do is they're going to come in and they're going to occupy Korea, okay? Because from here they're going to help us, okay? They're going to help us out from here, and you see how close they are. This is going to be their jumping off point, all right? And you see Formosa right here. You see Formosa, how close it is. That's what becomes Taiwan. I'm sorry. But they're going to jump in here, and about halfway down, they're going to occupy, okay? And so what happens after we drop the bomb, think about that. We dropped the bomb, a bomb they didn't know about. Their army is going to leave, but what they're going to leave behind is communism. Okay, they're going to leave behind communism. So that's what's happening here. You know, and we had both helped with the liberation of Korea from Japan. But you have a 38th parallel there, and that's where the Soviets had come down to. And below that is they're going to remain a democracy, okay? Now, the problem here, though, is you have nationalists in North Korea. They think, you know, Korea should be united. We should not be divided at the 38th parallel. You should not have a communist North Korea and a democratic South Korea. And so the North Koreans are going to invade the South. Okay. Now, here's the thing. We, the United States, thought the Soviets were behind the move. And it kind of makes sense for us to think that. It's communists on the move. Here's the problem in the United States, though. Behind every communist movement, we see the Soviet Union. And we see the spread of communism. We see the spread of Soviet communism. And it is not always the case. Okay? It is not always the case. Were the Soviets helping the North Koreans? Yes. Yes, they were. Was it them doing the major moving? No, it wasn't. But because we see the Soviets behind everything, and also because we didn't feel like we had done enough to stop China from becoming communist, we're going to get involved. We're going to take action in this time. And Truman's going to urge the United Nations to get involved with this. And now, the United Nations is, of course, not a U.S. Army. It is a United Nations Army, but this action is going to be led by the United States. Most of them are our troops. The commanders are U.S. And what happens is that we get there and we fight, and the goal of the general was different than the goal of the government, our government. Our government was to stop the spread of communism, containment, stop the spread, which meant that 38th parallel. It could be above the 38th parallel, but not below. And General MacArthur was not on board with that. And so what he's going to do is he's going to fight, and he's going to make it almost up to the Chinese border. And then the Chinese get ready to get involved. And we definitely don't want that. And so MacArthur's going to be fired. People are upset. It got ugly. But we got pushed back to the 38th parallel. And so in 1953, we're going to have some formal peace negotiations that end with North Korea contained above the 38th parallel. So, a victory for containment. 54,000 people killed for this. We gained nothing. We gained nothing except to still have a North and a South Korea. The only thing we gained is we don't have a united communist Korea. We can make a lot of comments about North Korea today. They are still communist, and they, you know, kind of crazy. Okay, here you have Stalin and the United States, Soviet Union and the United States, you know, staring each other down over Korea. Okay, you'll notice blood dripping from that. But for all that we didn't get rid of communism, this was a win. And that's the difference here in the Cold War. A win looks different than it used to. It's really weird. But we win this. This is considered a win. Israel is founded on May 14th, 1948. A lot of support for a new Israeli state, and a lot of that's because of the Holocaust. Well, I would say all of that is because of the Holocaust. A lot of guilt around the world, a lot of guilt in Europe, a lot of guilt in the United States. You have hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from Europe who want to go to Palestine, and Palestine, as this area down in here, and Palestine is the area, and this sets up a whole new area, a whole new problem that we're still dealing with today. But out of that Palestinian area, we're going to create Israel. Okay, the founding of Israel had the support of the UN. Okay, Truman is going to be the first one, the first world leader to call, but to officially recognize Israel. The problem is the Arabs in the region. They're going to resent giving part of Palestine to the Jews, and you're going to create the whole Palestinian issue out of this. Okay, the closest ally to Israel in the world is the United States. Okay, and we're going to help out Israel. They're a democracy, and you see that the Soviet Union is going to give their support to a lot of those other countries in the area. Okay, didn't mean to do that. Let's look at the Eisenhower Doctrine. Very similar, by the way, to the Truman Doctrine. This is a few years later, about 9 years later. I shouldn't say it like it's 2. It's about 9 years later, 1957. The president is now Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he states that the U.S. would not hesitate to aid any country in the Middle East that asks for help resisting communist aggression. So the real difference here is that the Truman Doctrine deals with Europe, and the Eisenhower Doctrine deals with the Middle East. It's just an extension into the Middle East. They're both the same, though, in that they both want to stop communism from spreading. Okay, just Truman Doctrine wants to stop it in Europe, and Eisenhower Doctrine in the Middle East. Okay, so we're going to specifically use it to help the Lebanese government resist communist-backed forces in Lebanon in 1958. And that's really the big one that you've got to know. But what I want you to do now on the sheet of paper I gave you is I want you to answer your first question. And the question is, how are the Truman and Eisenhower doctrines the same? And how are they different? Okay, if you have to go back a minute and listen to it again, go ahead and do so. But your question is, how are the Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower doctrines the same? And how are they different? Okay? All right. The next incident is the Bay of Pigs. This is in Cuba. Now, Cuba is 90 miles to the south of the United States. You can see how close it is. Look at the closeness here. You have the Keys out here, so we're talking like really close. Just keep in mind how close it is, okay? And this kind of all gets started back several years. In 1959, Fidel Castro is going to overthrow the Batista government in Cuba. Now, the Batista government has the support of the United States. Now, he is also a dictator, and we do support dictators. We support autocratic governments all the time as long as they are in our best interest. It's hard to look at what we do as a country and what we don't do from right or wrong, because you have to look at it beyond that. Yes, there is a right or wrong, so I don't mean to imply that a lot of what we do is right, but you've got to look at it from the perspective of best interest. What is in the best interest of the United States? The Batista government was good for the United States. Not so much for the Cuban people, but for the United States it was. It protected American businesses. It helped them, actually. And the American, there was a huge nightlife in Havana, and this was a major destination for people in the United States for vacations and stuff. So, I mean, you know, Cuba's a pretty big deal. And Fidel Castro is going to overthrow him in 1959. Now, here's the thing. The United States is going to step back and say, well, you know, it's okay. We can work with Fidel. And Batista was a dictator and not a good guy anyway, so we kind of backed him a little bit until we found out a few years later that he had ties to communism. And once we found that out, Eisenhower is going to break ties with Cuba. And since they no longer have U.S. support, Castro is going to go to the Soviet Union, and he is going to find himself a willing ally in the Soviet Union. And it makes sense from the Soviets' point of view. I mean, you've got an ally that's just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Okay? So now we've got this is not easy, right? I mean, look at that. How close it is. So Kennedy in 1961, the president is Kennedy, and what he's going to do is approve an invasion of Cuba. And they're not going to be Americans doing the invading. We are going to train, our CIA is going to train anti-Castro Cuban exiles. And their goal is to kind of start a popular uprising. You'll notice the Bay of Pigs is right here, okay? And we're going to train them, and we're going to drop them off, and it all goes downhill from there. There is no popular uprising. The Cubans kind of like Castro. They don't mind communism. They don't want the U.S. to jump in there and help them out. So it fails, and the United States abandons those Cubans that we had trained, and they are going to be imprisoned, killed. But the plan failed miserably, and U.S. prestige is going to suffer around the world. And Kennedy is looking out for his, let's call it a legacy. He's got to prove that he is an effective Cold Warrior, okay? He's got to prove his Cold War credentials around the world. So this was a big setback for him, okay? He'll help himself out a little bit with the Berlin Wall. Remember I said we had a divided Berlin? Well, in August of 1961, and it's been a little while since the Berlin airlift. That was in the late 40s, so it's been a little over a decade, okay, since the Berlin airlift, since the Berlin blockade. Khrushchev is now the leader of the Soviet Union, and they still have the problem of East Germans trying to leave the communist-controlled area and go to the free area. And so what he's going to do is he's going to build a wall, okay? And it is going to separate communist East Berlin from the democratic West Berlin. And this becomes a symbol of the Cold War, and it stays that way until 1989. And in November of 1989, you can see some pictures here of the wall. You have people out there with sledgehammers beating down the wall, okay? This wall literally split the city, and you can see it being built here. And they have guards set up, and if you try to escape, they shoot you. You kind of peek over to see what's going on the other side. It's very depressing, very depressing. Kennedy, this happens while Kennedy is there, and he's going to actually make a speech at the Brandenburg Gate, and I don't know, it is a depressing symbol of the Cold War. It is literally a wall in between the two sides, an impassable wall, okay? Reagan's later going to make a speech, and he's just going to tell him point blank, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And we'll talk more about that in Chapter 10. The next incident is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, this is 1962. This is 13 days rather, in October. This one is a little bit more serious. The Soviets are actually getting involved. And they are going to secretly put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now remember, that's 90 miles to the south of us. And we have spy planes flying overhead. And they are able to pick up the evidence. I don't look at this and see evidence, but the people at the time, those working in military intelligence, are able to see it. Somehow or another, you can tell that that's a missile shelter tent and fuel tank trailers. Anyway, so they know what they're looking for, but they can tell that they've got nuclear missiles, nuclear weapons. Why do we care? Well, because look at how close we are. Look at how far. And this is another way of looking at it. If they've got nuclear missiles, they can hit just about every single part of the United States. And it does kind of create a bit of a panic. Okay, so how are we going to respond to that? Again, we are not going to bomb them. They have nuclear weapons at this point. We are not going to bomb them. Bad things will happen. And so what you do is you have a standoff between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Okay, and they're eventually, and we go right up to the brink of war, right up to the brink of war. I love how this one kind of, it has both of them sitting on hydrogen bombs, and both of their fingers are on the button, and they're playing a game of their arm wrestling, and who's going to blink first? Who's going to blink first? And it happens to be the Soviet Union. Now, here's the thing. We've got ships here. They've got ships coming. The Soviet Union has ships coming. We put ships out here to block them. They can't get there. And there is the threat that if they keep coming, we're gonna fire on them. And if we fire on them, then they could send those missiles into the United States. So that's where the tenseness came. The deal is going to come through at the last minute. And what happens? Okay, Castro's not invited to the meeting again. You notice how sometimes we seem to leave out key components in these things. And so Khrushchev is going to agree to take the nuclear weapons out of Cuba. And Cuba is going to be disillusioned, and they're going to stay a nominal ally of the Soviet Union, but no real trust between them again. And I love how Khrushchev is telling this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. Post-war alliances, almost there. Post-war alliances, you have the United Nations and you have NATO. These are ours, okay? The UN is established in 1945. It has a Security Council, which is made up of the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. And then China also, and you have 2 temporary seats, okay? And they have the most power in this. But this was intended to provide a place to go for countries to negotiate instead of going to war. You might call this an updated version of the League of Nations, one that actually will go to war. Okay, and its headquarters is going to be in New York. Actually, it's going to be on land donated by the Rockefellers. Okay, NATO, on the other hand, now there's been a lot of talk about NATO recently. Member nations are supposed to pay a fee, pay a due, and there's been a lot of talk lately that some countries, particularly a reunified Germany, has not been paying their dues. Also, do we really need NATO anymore? Communism is dead. Do we need to keep it? But regardless, it's still with us, even though there's a lot going on with it today. But it was formed in 1949, and you have the United States and then several European nations, and I have them listed here: Belgium, Denmark, Italy, France, Iceland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and Great Britain. You do not need to know that. You do not. I would essentially, if you wanted to, put out there Western Europe. Okay, also Greece and Turkey, but for the most part, it is most of Western Europe. Okay, and they basically agreed to come to each other's defense if they were attacked. Okay, but I keep going back to that. The other side of that one, the Soviets, was the Warsaw Pact. Okay, and these are members of the Eastern Bloc nations, and the members were the Eastern Bloc nations in the Soviet Union. And essentially it unites the communist countries of Eastern Europe in a similar pact as NATO was. And if they're attacked, they will defend each other. Okay? So my ending question for you here is based on everything we've heard, everything I've talked about. What was our main enemy during the Cold War? Don't give me a country. I don't want the name of a country. I don't want the nation itself, because there were multiple nations. What are we fighting against? What is our big enemy? Okay, and that will be your second question for the day. Okay, when you're done, turn your paper in and begin the next assignment. Oh, I should also add, if you have any questions, if there's anything that was stated that I didn't really explain very well, ask it. Put that question down and I'll try to cover that tomorrow as well.